So this week's Pensioners for Independence podcast comes to you courtesy of the Greater Glasgow Group, and it's a talk which we asked Tim Rideout to give us. It's called Timeline for Setting Up a Scottish Currency. Tim set up the Scottish Currency Group, and there's a website associated with that called the reservebank.scot website. So far he's done about 25 talks on currency and the economics of independence, covering groups all over the country from Dumfries to Stornoway. You may remember that Tim had rather a starring role at the SNP 2019 conference, the April conference, where he, to put it in his own words, demolished the case for Scotland retaining use of sterling after independence. That was the policy recommended by the Growth Commission. Tim's own view is, let's have our own currency as soon as practicable after independence. That means 2 to 3 months. The Growth Commission talked about using sterling for up to 15 years. So you can see there's a big gap between Tim Rideout's view of currency and the what we might call orthodox SNP view on currency. So it's a really good talk, lasts about half an hour, and after that there's a question and answers with the Glasgow Group, which covered matters like, you said a government deficit doesn't matter, or at least doesn't matter as much as we might think it would matter. Could you just explain that? We asked him about the accuracy of Scotland's exports being greater than our imports, whether or not that's camouflaged by goods that come into us via England. We had a question about what proportion of our economy would be good to have as manufacturing rather than, services. So we talked a bit about pensions. Some pensions might be paid to us in sterling, whether that be an advantage or a disadvantage. Tim thinks it would be an advantage because he reckons the Scots pound's going to go up against sterling. We talked a bit about that, the value of Scottish banknotes. We also got on to full reserve banks or mutually owned banks. Are they the preferable banking model for us? And then at the end, a really good question. Are we going to manage to cope with independence after this pandemic crisis and then possibly falling over a cliff, or could this economic chaos actually be a help to get to independence faster? So it's a really good talk and a good set of questions. The talk's about 30 minutes, questions are about 20 minutes.
So yes, we're very lucky to have Tim here to speak to us about currency, which is something, of course, that they're always the unions are always trying to find a notch here to get in. I know everybody's worried about currency because it's what we use every day, but very few people understand it. But Tim is one who understands it, and he's also going to talk about setting up a central bank, which is essential, as we know, when we had all that bother with the bank in the past. We need a central bank. Any independent country needs that. So without further ado, I'll let Tim do any other introductions.
Thank you very much for asking me to talk to you. So I think this is the 27th or 28th talk, the third virtual one. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I'll just run through my plan for introducing a new currency and setting up a central bank and so forth. Probably the best way of dealing with it. So we're going to do a future history. I'm quite keen on science fiction. I like the sort of Star Trek, sort of Star Wars type sort of optimistic things. Not as keen on somebody like Philip K. Dick, but anyway. So we're going to start from next year. I have reluctantly changed the date of the next independence referendum to September 2021. So my prediction, and obviously when you make these things and put it all down as specific dates, then I'm opening myself to it all turning out to be completely wrong, but hopefully it won't be. So I'm saying we could have the next independence referendum on Thursday, 9th of September next year. And there'll be a bit of a disaster because the fire brigade's going to get called out to Pacific Quay at about 10:30 when Jackson Carlott has managed to lock himself in the broom cupboard trying to avoid the cameras after the exit poll comes out as 64% yes. Anyway, the carrier pigeon reaches Boris in London on Saturday, and the government in London concedes that we have voted to leave the Union. So I think a number of things should then happen pretty shortly after that. I don't know whether any of you have heard of the Statute of Westminster 1931, but this was simply the process by which the Imperial Parliament, and they did call it the Imperial Parliament in those days, agreed that it would stop passing legislation for Canada, Australia and so forth without their permission. So as of 1st of January 1932, while Westminster continued to pass legislation and still does occasionally, it doesn't do anything for the Dominions without written permission from Australia, Canada and so on. So I think Scotland should be added to that list. So it's not independence, but it just means that whenever Westminster still passes a bill for us, they will have to get our permission. So for the budget, for example. I would also remove the list of reserved powers from the Scotland Act. So Holyrood is going to need to be able to set up things like the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and all of those sort of things that it's not allowed to do at the moment. And last but not least, the Scottish Government should be ready to follow the official SNP policy as voted for at the conference in April 2019, that we should start the preparations for our own currency as soon as possible after a vote for independence. So October the 4th, they introduced at stage 1 at Holyrood the Scottish Reserve Bank Establishment Bill. Just quick refreshment about what I call the Silly Six tests. These were the things which the Growth Commission came up with in the section C on currency, and I pretty much demolished them, I think, at the SNP conference last year, but they still seem to be lurking sort of zombie-like with the leadership of the SNP clinging onto them like that's some sort of lifebelt. So let's just have a quick run through. Test 1 was about deficits and debt. Now, at the moment, the Scottish Parliament is not allowed to have debt. So we basically don't have any. So in that case, we're going to start life as an independent country with zero debts. So I don't see how debt can possibly be an issue for setting up the currency. When it comes to deficits, there are two types of deficit. The British government only looks at one, which is the government deficit, and the JERS figures are all about whether the Scottish government would or would not have a deficit. And it's worth pointing out that at the moment, the Holyrood Parliament never has a deficit. In fact, it was just announced yesterday, I believe, that we had a surplus of 285 million for last year, which the Tories and Labour routinely castigated for us not having spent all the money. So Scottish Parliament doesn't have a deficit. If there is a deficit, it arises in London with the bill for maintaining the Queen's palaces and Crossrail 2 and HS2 and the military and so forth. The deficit that the British government never likes to talk about is the trade deficit. And that's whether your country pays its way in the world or not. And at the moment, the UK does not. It has the worst deficit ever. It's about 150 billion deficit on the balance payments this year. The estimates for Scotland are completely different. They suggest that our imports approximately equal the exports. And so therefore, that means that Scotland pays its way in the world while the UK does not. So we have no need for any external borrowing because we are exporting enough to pay for everything that we wish to import. Government deficit, the Scottish government on independence probably will have a deficit. It might be quite a big deficit, could be 8 or 10% of GDP. That's not a bad thing. The government deficit, because it's a double entry accounting system, is a private sector surplus. So if the government runs a deficit, means we all have a surplus. We have some extra money left that we can save. If the government was to start running a surplus, it means that the private sector has a deficit instead, and means that we are end up at the end of each month being short of money and have to borrow to cover that deficit. So as soon as you understand that, then you start realizing that the Tory austerity and obsession about government deficits is actually completely wrong. And what it's intended to do is to push the private sector into debt. And the people who are going to lend us that debt and collect the interest on it and so forth are obviously those who are the wealthiest, and the banks and the financiers and so on. So don't worry about deficits. Government deficit for Scotland after independence is necessary, and it's a good thing to ensure a boom for the first few years of independence. The second of these tests was, do we have a credible central bank? And the answer to that is you can't answer that question until after it's been running for maybe 5 or even 10 years. When we had the Greek debt crisis, the European Central Bank had already been running the euro for 10 years. People were still asking whether it was a credible central bank or not. So you can't answer that question in advance. You have to introduce the currency, let the central bank manage it, and then you can decide some years down the line if it's doing a good job or not. As a test, it's designed simply to ensure that we never have a currency. Test 3, does it meet the needs of the people and business? Well, any currency does that. All a currency needs to do is to be a medium of exchange. Can you go into a shop and buy something with it? It's a store of value. Can you stick it under the mattress and come back a year later and still use it? And it's a unit of account. So can you keep your business accounts in this currency? In the past, there was a Pacific island which used cowrie shells as its currency, and those worked perfectly well. So any currency is going to meet the needs. You then have this perennial question about reserves for Scotland, foreign reserves. There is a Glasgow economist called Ronald MacDonald at Glasgow University, who said in August last year that we would have to have £300 billion of foreign reserves before we could consider having a currency. Professor MacDonald moonlights writing press releases for the Tory party. And I think his knowledge of economics is severely lacking, because the UK's reserves are $55 billion US. If the UK manages on $55 billion, why on earth would Scotland need £300 billion? By comparison, Denmark and Finland have foreign reserves of about 10 billion euros each. So that's probably about the level Scotland would need. But we don't need to worry about reserves because they're automatic, as I'll show you later on. Does the currency fit our trade patterns? Again, this is ridiculous. If you're trading with the US, you change your money into dollars. If you're trading with Europe, you change it into euros. So what? And lastly, we had this test about decoupling from the business cycle of the UK, which we should do. That the UK has mismanaged the economy for at least 100 years, right back to Churchill precipitating the general strike in 1926 by causing mass unemployment and deflation. So we should do that. But if we use sterling for 10 or 15 years, which is the Growth Commission suggestion, we are not going to decouple from the UK, because we're handing over all our economic policy to being run for us in London. The UK would be deciding on the exchange rate, they'd be deciding on the interest rate, deciding on the money supply, and so forth. It's not really independence at all. So the only way you're going to decouple from the UK business cycle is to have your own currency and have control of your own economic policy. So let's get rid of those and consider the sort of things that we should be looking at, which are actually relevant to getting a currency up and running. So we need the draft of the bill to set up the central bank. We should have that ready before the referendum. You don't want to be, you want to be prepared. It's no use saying, right, well, we just voted for independence, what do we do now? Because all of these things are going to need legislation. It's going to take 6 months or so to get the bill through Holyrood. And there's not just one bill, there's going to be lots of things. So they all need to be ready. We need to make sure that the new banknotes and the coins will be ready in time. And I think this is one of the most time-consuming things. It can take around a year to get your notes and coins designed, tested, make sure they work for blind people, colorblind people. You don't want your new sort of £1 Scots coin to turn out to be the same size as the Thai 10-cent piece, and all that sort of stuff. We need to have a new interbank payment system. So at the moment, if you use a cash machine or a credit card or log into internet banking, that's all going through the sterling bank payment system. Obviously, once we have the Scottish pound, that can't go through a sterling system. We need a Scottish pound payment system. It's not that difficult. There is an international standard for bank computer networks, bank payment systems, which is designed for the euro. So we just need to duplicate that, call it the Scottish pound. That's already compatible with bank computer systems. So they just add on a Scottish pound as another currency that they deal in. So the Royal Bank, for example, you can have an account in sterling, you can have an account in dollars, you can have an account in euros, various other currencies. So they just add another currency to that, which would be the Scottish pound. We need a public information campaign. As you said in the introduction, people get very concerned about their money and their savings and so forth. So as soon as the referendum has finished and been won, we need to start explaining to people what's going to happen about their money. So for the first 18 months or so of the transition period, if we assume there's a 2-year transition, for the public, nothing will change. They will carry on using sterling just as they do at the moment. It's only as Independence Day approaches that you'll have to start doing something. Obviously, that's not true for the behind the scenes, in that quite a lot of work needs to be done to set up the central bank and so forth, but that doesn't involve the public. We'll need to have the premises, staff and so forth for the central bank, which I'm calling the Scottish Reserve Bank, in place. Professor Warren Mosler, who's a US economist, said that the basic central bank needs about £15,000 of computer equipment, a bank accounting software package, a connection into the bank payment system, a one-room office, and a couple of people to run it. So a central bank is not an inherently complicated thing. Things about financial regulation and so on are bells and whistles that can be added on to the central bank. We need a plan for financial regulation. The Growth Commission says we should just cut and paste the UK system. I think that'd be a very bad idea. The UK system ensures that the people work for the banks and the financiers, and we need something that means that the banks and financiers work for the people. And for example, I would suggest that instead of having a list of things that banks are not allowed to do, we should have a list of things that banks are allowed to do. So when they come up with something new, like credit default swaps, we can just say it's not on the list, you can't do it. Make out a safety case, demonstrate it's proper and useful, and we'll consider it. At the moment, the UK system basically says you can do anything you like, so long as it's not prohibited. So by definition, anything new is always allowed. And which will probably interest you, I'm suggesting that we should have a sterling pensioner guarantee. So the pensioner guarantee, obviously, when we introduce a new currency, if you're getting something like the UK state pension or a private pension from an employer, whatever, that will be continue to be paid in sterling, and unless it's a Scottish company, that means that you're then going to be exposed to an exchange rate risk. So if the Scottish pound went down against sterling, you would benefit because you get more money. So if you're talking to somebody who says, oh, I'm not voting for independence, the pound will just, your new currency will just plummet, they should be voting for independence immediately, because if they're getting a pension that's paid in sterling, they'll double their money or treble their money. So, you know, what's to complain about? The problem arises more because I think the new Scottish currency is probably going to go up against sterling. And that is a problem because you're then going to have a pension income that would, in that case, it would be going down once converted. So the pensioner guarantee simply says that the pensioner gets the higher of the actual exchange or the one-to-one exchange. So if the Scottish pound fell, you'd benefit. If the Scottish pound goes up, the Scottish government makes up the shortfall. And you still get, if you're getting £70 a week as a pension in sterling, you would get £70 Scottish as a minimum. So that's a sort of good test about setting up our currency. So let's run forward through the timeline. So in 2022, the independence arrangements are busy being negotiated. Scottish Reserve Bank Act receives royal assent, and it moves into its new premises at the Royal High School in Edinburgh. So I've identified that. It's not going to cost us anything. It's already publicly owned by Edinburgh City Council. It's been empty since 1979, and it's got these nice sort of central bank Greek temple sort of appearance. So when somebody from the Scottish Broadcasting Corporation is interviewing the governors or whatever on the steps of the bank, they'll have that nice sort of Greek temple portico in the background. In 2023, the Scottish Parliament will decide the aims of the Scottish Reserve Bank. And this is important in that there's a right-wing myth that the central bank is independent of government. It's not. Central bank is a key part of government. The Bank of England is owned by the Treasury, has been since it was nationalised in 1947, and it does what the Chancellor tells it to do. And that's correct and proper. The pretending that it doesn't was merely a method of trying to hand over control of the economy to bankers and pretending that politicians couldn't do anything about it. So, as I said, the aims will be set by Parliament, and I would suggest that they could include such things as the bank being directed to run monetary policy such that full employment was maintained. It's not very radical that the US central bank is required to do that. Secondary target, keeping inflation fairly low. The Bank of England is not required to do anything except keep inflation at 2%. Obviously, inflation is, it's not a problem for people who have debts. If you have mortgages and credit card debts and things like that, inflation's quite good because it means they go down in value. If you're in work or you have an index-linked pension, inflation is not a big problem because your income goes up a bit, prices go up a bit, your income goes up a bit, whatever. So it's a bit sort of keeps more or less in step. If you are a billionaire and you have £1 billion of cash, then inflation's a big problem. If you have 5% inflation, you're losing 50 million a year. And equally, if you own the debts, so you're one of the big sort of rich financiers or something that people owe money to, inflation's also very bad because it means you get back less than you lent. So if your only policy is to maintain a low inflation, then I would suggest that that means you're only really interested in looking after the very wealthy. Mid-2023, this is where the public, so all of us, are going to get involved. So you'll get a letter from your bank asking if you would like to have Scottish pounds. And it's important to stress that this is entirely voluntary. So Ruth Davidson can keep her £300 a week from taking the Urban in sterling if she wants to. She can stuff it in the mattress, keep it all in lovely Bank of England £10 notes. For those who do want to have Scottish currency accounts, then all they have to do is say to the bank, yes, they would like a current account, savings account, credit card, debit card, or whatever. Anybody else, somebody, for example, who lives in London but plans to move back to Scotland or works in Dubai or whatever, they can just contact a Scottish bank and say that they would like to have a Scottish currency account. I'd expect most businesses would probably keep their existing sterling account and they would add a Scottish currency account. We work for a Canadian company, and I've discussed this with them. They have a US dollar account, a Canadian dollar account, a US dollar credit card machine and a Canadian dollar credit card machine. If they get a US customer on the phone, they pay in US dollars. If they get a Canadian customer, they pay in Canadian dollars. It's not really very difficult. And at this point, the designs for the notes and coins have been finalized, and we get a company like De La Rue to manufacture them. If any of you are eagerly waiting for your nearly black new British passport, Boris Johnson's going to be disappointed when he gets his, because it's going to say in little gold letters on the back, printed in the European Union, because they're being manufactured in Poland. '30th of November 2023, I think St Andrew's Day would be a nice day for independence. So Queen's going to get her titles right for the first time in her life. So Elizabeth I and II will wheel the Zimmer frame onto the esplanade of Edinburgh Castle in order to preside over the lowering of the Union flag for the last time. And one of these talks, somebody said, oh, but I wouldn't say something like that, you know, lowering the Union flag sounds a bit, you know, for the last time sounds a bit radical, you might put people off. But I kind of thought the whole point about independence was to lower the Union flag for the final time. Anyway, thanks to advances in quantum physics, I can take you to the esplanade to see the first pictures of the independence celebrations. As the world's biggest fireworks display takes place over Edinburgh. Now, one or two people get a bit purist about things and say that we have to have a new currency. I think the 1st of December 2023 is not a good day to start introducing a currency or anything else. Most people are going to be in bed until about 8 o'clock in the evening with a nasty hangover. So we should probably leave it slightly. And I'm going to wait about 2 months after Independence Day for the new currency to come in. So in December, the banks will start posting out new checkbooks, credit cards, whatever people have asked for. Just as at the moment, you know, when your credit card's about to expire, you get a new one a few weeks beforehand, and it's got a start date on it. So 2 weeks before the new currency comes into effect, same as with the euro, you'd be able to go to the bank or the post office and buy a starter pack, which would have one each of the notes and coins. I've got some designs here that were done by an art student at Napier University. '27th, 28th of January, the weekend, 2024, is the changeover weekend. Public don't need to do too much, but banks are going to be busy and other people on your behalf. So for those people who've asked for it, if you have, you can specify that you want all your money converted into Scottish pounds, £500 converted, 10% converted, none of it converted, whatever. So whatever you've asked for, let's say it's £500 you're going to have changed over. The bank that you use, let's say the Clydesdale Bank, they will take your £500, they will sell it to the Scottish Reserve Bank, and the Scottish Reserve Bank will issue Scottish pounds to the equivalent value, so 500 Scottish pounds, and those will go into your new Scottish currency account. So if you had £500 and £0, you know, your accounts will just switch over. The sterling will go down by 500, your Scottish pound account go up by 500. And this is the interesting bit. The £500 sterling that you had to pay for your new Scottish pounds now belongs to the Scottish Reserve Bank. That's why I said our reserves, the foreign reserves, are automatic. You know, every Scottish pound issued is paid for by £1 sterling handed in. So on this first weekend, if 40% of our sterling is changed, that would be about 40 billion pounds, because there's around 100 billion sterling that belongs to people and companies in Scotland. So that's 40 billion pounds of foreign reserves going into the central bank, and 40 billion Scottish pounds being issued in place of that sterling. So we actually, at that point, have almost the same foreign reserves as the UK has. The UK has 55 billion US dollars. There's 2 trillion of sterling. If you liquidated sterling, you would get 2 US cents in the pound, whereas we're going to have £1 of reserves for each Scottish pound issued. That will change over time. It'll go down, but to start with, the Scottish pound has 100% foreign reserves. Over the weekend, the vending machines get converted and the cash machines get converted. So on the Monday morning, you are not going to get sterling out of a machine anymore. And if you want to put money into a parking machine or a station ticket machine or whatever, it'll have to be the Scottish currency. We'll no longer accept sterling. You can still use sterling in a shop or a restaurant or something like that. They're interchangeable. But what's going to happen at the end of the first day, the shopkeeper will take the money that they have to the bank. The bank will fish out all of the sterling currency and they will sell it to the central bank. And when the shopkeeper picks up the float the next day, it'll only be Scottish currency. So you'll find, I think, that as happened with the euro, I was in Germany, the Deutschmark notes and coins disappeared in a week. And I think you'll find the same thing will happen here. People can still use them. Ruth Davidson can still keep using her £300 a day and spend it in her local shop. But for the average person, you'll very quickly find that sterling disappears from use and it switches over painlessly to being the Scottish pound. Since most the currency and things these days is digital and done with cards, then your sterling card will carry on working and there'll be no penalty for the first 5 weeks or so to using sterling credit cards or debit cards, but you can start using your Scottish ones instead. So that's the money on sale, your new cards all working. About 5 weeks later, we're going to end the peg to sterling and the Scottish pound will start to float on the foreign exchange market. And at this point, the bank is going to start treating sterling as a foreign currency. So while somebody can, a big company like Standard Aberdeen, they can carry on paying the wages in sterling if they want to. But after this point, they'll start getting complaints from the staff because if you get sterling, you will then have to do a foreign exchange transaction to change it into Scottish pounds, which means the bank will charge you 2.5% for the director's Christmas bonus fund, just the same as at the moment if you use a sterling card in Spain, you get home, you look at your statement, and it says, X euros converted at such and such an exchange rate plus 2.5% for the fees. So by the end of this year, I think the Scottish currency is going to have gone up slightly. Don't want it to go up too much, but Brexit's going to carry on exerting downward pressure on sterling. And there are a number of reasons why the Scottish pound is going to tend to go up, which is that there's going to be a bit of a shortage of Scottish pounds. That means the pensioner guarantee is in operation. So people getting a sterling pension are going to be topped up by 12 pence in the pound to ensure that they still have the same value at this end. Scottish Reserve Bank's going to be sitting on 50 billion and rising of foreign reserves. We're not going to keep it as sterling. We're going to sell the sterling and we'll convert it into euros, dollars, gold, etc. And we'll all be going, why didn't we do this years ago? So that's the end of the formal talk. I'll just mention briefly and just keep an eye on time. Whenever we get to the next SNP conference, I have a motion that I want to put to it about its principles for the establishment of the central bank. So if you're in an SNP branch, you can try and get your branch to support that in due course. I won't go through it all now. If you're into Facebook, we have the Scottish Currency Group on Facebook. We just today, in fact, reached 400 members. And in the last couple of days, we've had Angus Brendan McNeill MP, Owen Johnson MP, Leslie Riddoch, Professor Richard Murphy, and John McNally MP and Martin Day MP have all joined the Scottish Currency Group. And finally, if you visit the reservebank.scot website, you can see a recording of this talk, and there's lots of information about plan for the currency. We've also got a new statistics section which is focusing on the coronavirus. So it's updated every day, and you can get the stats on how many cases there are and where they are and things like that. So at that point, I'll stop and we can have questions or the tea break or whatever.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim. That was really informative.
It's this deficit thing I can't get, not the trade deficit, I mean, I do understand that, but this deficit where the government runs a deficit and that benefits us, can you explain it in a different way so that I might grasp the idea?
If you consider the national economy as a box divided into two halves, you have the government half and the private half. So if the government side of the box runs a deficit, the only place the place where the deficit arises or goes to is that it ends up being a surplus for the private sector. So it means that the government is spending more than it takes in, which means that we all get more than we spend, which allows us to save. If you turn it round the other way and you say that the government is going to give out less than it takes in and run a surplus, then it just simply means that we have a deficit instead. So we're going to find that we have more bills than we have money coming in, and we're going to have to borrow. So one side of the equation has to have a deficit, and it's much more comfortable and pleasant for us if it's the government which has a deficit. The government deficit really doesn't matter because the government is the source of our money, and if the government spends more money than it takes in tax, it allows us to save and cover our expenses. So that's why I say it doesn't really matter. And if the government, you've been fed a lie over the years because the government has to spend first, and it then takes the money back as tax at the end of the process. The tax collection is not the start. You consider we're starting a new country of Scotland. We're starting with a new currency. So at the moment, we don't have any Scottish pounds. The Scottish government doesn't have any Scottish pounds. So the only way they get created is by the Scottish government spending them into existence. It can't tax anyone of Scottish pounds because there are no Scottish pounds to tax. So it's always the case that spending comes first, and then tax takes the money back to the state. Because if you think about what money actually is, if you look at the Bank of England note, it says, "I promise to pay." And that's all money is. It's an IOU from the government. And the government issues the IOUs, they circulate around the economy, and eventually the government takes them back via the tax system. When an IOU is returned to the person that issued it, it ceases to exist. So every time you pay your tax bill, that money doesn't go anywhere. It's just destroyed when it hits the Bank of England's computer system.
So it doesn't actually matter what the deficit, the deficit doesn't matter then at all, really?
It does matter, because if the government spends too much relative to the amount that it takes back in tax, then you'll get inflation. So the government should run its finances so that it spends enough to ensure full employment. But once you reach full employment, then it needs to stop. And it should then increase the tax and reduce its spending so that you just stay in a nice balance at full employment with inflation under control. You don't do what Gordon Brown did in the sort of 2000s of have a booming economy and house prices going through the roof and then give everyone 5% a year pay rises in the civil service. As soon as you get mass unemployment, it means the government's not spending enough.
Great, thanks very much for that. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? It's about what you said about Scotland's imports and exports being balanced, and I know that the HMRC very helpfully provides breakdown of numbers for that, but Are you sure that there aren't, say, imports that are ending up in Scotland but are coming in through England and are kind of being camouflaged?
Oh yeah, so I mean it's a complete guess as to the actual figures, but the Scottish government has looked at this, and their best guess is that imports and exports are about balanced. But I mean, there's probably a lot of stuff that's exported from Scotland, processed in England, sort of like
Yeah.
Scottish beef that is sent down to England, mixed with potatoes, and then sent off to France as a Cornish pasty or something, in which case it counts as an English export and not a Scottish one.
Could I just ask?
So I would suspect that Sorry?
The energy that we export all the time to England to cover, is that included in our?
Yes.
That's included.
You'll see figures. You'll see figures banded around for Scottish exports being to the UK, to the rest of the UK, being £49 billion a year. 20 billion of that is electricity, gas, and refined hydrocarbons. Those go by pipeline and cable. So, in fact, it's quite interesting. Of the 49 billion figures, I said 20 billion is energy of one form or another and chemicals. So take that out. You've got 29 billion left. About half of that is services. So architecture, Tesco Bank being based in Glasgow, Sainsbury's Bank up here as well, insurance policies, things like that. Leaves about 15 billion, which is actual boxes, lorries going over the border. Our exports to the European Union of goods are also 15 billion. And the European Union exports are going up about 8% a year. The boxes of goods going to England going up about 1% a year. So in terms of which one we should concentrate on, you go for the one with the growth, which is the European Union. The English exports, they're not going to close the border. There are, I think, only 3 countries in the world where the UK has a trade surplus, and that's its trade with Scotland, Ireland, and the United States. So given they have a massive deficit everywhere else, if they close the border and end their trade with Scotland, then it's their surplus they're cutting off and not ours. We can replace the imports, stop buying Jaguars and get a Mercedes instead.
Can I just ask a bit of a follow-up on that? Do you think that proportion of services, the proportion that it makes up of the Scottish economy, do you think that leaves us in a healthy place as an economy? Is it too much? Does it matter?
I think we should make more. Mm-hmm. We're a bit sort of orientated towards primary commodities, so food and agriculture exports. We need, when we're doing renewable energy, then the wind turbines need to be made in Scotland, not imported from Indonesia. Yeah. So a lot that could be done on that front.
Yeah. I was just wanting to clarify your point on the pensions. When the currency difference, getting a pension paid in sterling, I'm assuming you're only talking about state pension. Private pensions will just float with the currency.
Well, most private pensions are probably going to be used. They're probably going to be because you worked for a company that was English based. Now, if you have a British Airways pension, it's going to be paid in sterling. If you have a UK civil service pension, not a Scottish civil service pension, but a UK one, it would be paid in sterling. If you had a pension plan based around the London Stock Exchange, it's going to be paid in sterling. So there are some, the Scottish civil service pensions, the NHS pensions, council pensions in Scotland, they will all be converted and be paid in Scottish pounds. If you had a Scottish pension provider, like say Scottish Widows, they will probably convert it into Scottish pounds as well. But there will be a lot of people who have some sort of pension that's paid by an English company or the UK government or an English council or something like that.
Right. See, for every pound this Scotland has, right, there's a pound kept in the Bank of England. Is that right? And if
no,
so, if it is, that money should be coming back.
That applies to the Scottish bank notes.
Yes, Correct. That's what I mean. The notes.
Yes.
So the money, whether
my,
that is, should come back.
My plan would allow the Scottish banks to continue to issue their own notes.
Mhm.
They'll have to withdraw the ones that are in circulation at the moment because they say sterling on them.
Mhm.
They'd have to print new ones which don't say sterling. And I would also allow other banks than just the existing three to do their own notes if they wanted to. But the three banks at the moment have 4.5 billion on deposit at the Bank of England. That would transfer to the Scottish Reserve Bank instead.
So I didn't catch the figure.
It's
Broke away there.
4.5 billion. 4.5 billion.
4.5. Right. Okay.
I just wanted to ask the address that you gave that this was repeated on this talk.
Yes, reservebank.scot.
Reserve Bank. And can I say I've enjoyed that thoroughly? Because I don't know very much about money except spending it. Thank you.
The Reserve Bank has been thought about already. How far is any movement been going in actually making it happen thus far? Has there been anything practically done?
Only by me.
How can we change that?
In terms of the SNP leadership, which seems to mean Nicola Sturgeon and Andrew Wilson, they're sticking to we're just going to use sterling for 10 or 15 years. Bit.
Okay.
So that's why I do these talks and why I'm running this campaign, because that's a nonsense position. It'll collapse within a week or two of the start of a referendum campaign, let alone after independence.
Is the currency you're talking about, is that a full reserve currency you're proposing?
What do you mean by a full reserve currency?
Well, I understood that, I don't know do you know Andy Anderson?
Yes.
I think what he was meaning was the currency would be, the bank would be government controlled, and the thing that attracted me to his proposition was if the currency value is based on the resources of the country, basically. And so if, for instance, if you were wanting to make some large project that was going to, roads or rail or whatever, that would actually become an additional resource. So you could actually print the money to pay for that. And because it was on a resource, the currency value would stay the same.
Well, I had a sort of quite a long meeting with Andy Anderson about his ideas, and there's no such thing as a full reserve currency. So far as I can understand, what he wants is more things like the Trustees Savings Bank or the credit unions or the old building societies, which were mutually owned or something like that. But none of those are actually full reserve. You can't have a bank that's full reserve, because the whole point of a bank is that it lends money it doesn't have. And that's why if we all go round to a bank and demand our money back, they always collapse because they don't have it, because it's lent out to people. I don't think full reserve is a helpful way of describing it. All currencies are given their value by the fact that the state requires that you use it, and that you have to pay your tax bill in that currency. If you can't go to HMRC and ask to pay your tax bill in dollars because they won't accept it. So you have to have sterling to pay your tax bill, which is what, for any currency, the first rule of having a successful currency is that all official transactions, so whether that's government payments or government receipts, tax payments, parking ticket payments, government paying suppliers, whatever, is only in the national currency. And basically the fact that you have to pay your tax in Scottish pounds is what gives the Scottish pound its value. Externally, its value will be decided on the foreign exchange market, but that's not really in our control. We just leave that to, it'll go up or down based on how well Scotland's doing. So, yeah, I'm all in favour of more mutually owned banks. I didn't approve of the privatisation of the building societies. We should have, we shouldn't have given up things like the trustee savings bank. So as far as that sort of thing is concerned, I'm all in favour of it, but they're not actually full reserve. You can't have a bank that's full reserve.
You just raised a point there that crossed my mind. At the changeover from the Scottish currency or the sterling to Scottish currency, if let's say you pay your tax to the UK, your income tax to the UK as like self-assessment, you're a year behind. So then at the changeover, would you then be advocating keeping sterling or some sterling to pay that tax bill to the UK if they're not going to accept a foreign currency?
Yes, so far as, if you have a sterling liability, let's say you have a sterling credit card that you need to pay off, then yes, you would keep some sterling to do that. Otherwise, you'd have to then change your Scottish pounds into sterling. But since I'm predicting that the Scottish pound would tend to go up, you could always take a punt that sterling would go down, and by the time you paid your tax bill, you'd actually save a bit of money because the Scottish pound would buy you, let's say, £1.10 for each Scottish pound you exchanged at the bank. But as a general principle, I wouldn't suggest that, for example, you kept a mortgage in sterling because you're taking a risk. But there was a lot of people in Poland in the 2000s who thought it was clever to take out Swiss franc mortgages because the interest rate on the Swiss franc mortgage was lower than it was on a zloty mortgage. They all got their fingers burnt because the Swiss franc went up enormously, and they're now having to pay back twice as much as they borrowed.
Okay.
Marvin?
In the foreign exchange market, it's purely the price of the Scottish pound is decided based on how many sellers there are and how many buyers. And immediately after immediately after the currency comes into use, there are not going to be many sellers because the only people who have the Scottish pound will be us, and we've just changed our sterling into the Scottish pound. So if you just changed it into the Scottish pound, you wouldn't immediately want to go and change it back again. The international market doesn't have any Scottish pounds at the start, so they can't do anything very much. People often ask me about speculators, and they're going to speculate against the currency, but it's very difficult to speculate against currency when you don't have any of it. The international money market has no Scottish pounds, so we can't borrow any even if we wanted to.
Yeah, just wondering what makes you confident that the Scots pound will go up against sterling? And the other thing I was going to ask was, what does it actually mean to decouple from the RUK business cycle?
The business cycle is just the sort of booms and the booms and busts. They sort of depressions going, or economy growing or going down or whatever. And all we're saying is we shouldn't follow whatever the UK is doing. The UK has tended to have quite significant, 2008, there was huge collapse now due to the virus. We should try and make sure that our managing of the economy smooths things out as much as possible and keeps us on a fairly upward trend, but a trend that is ours, not just copying what somebody else is doing.
We're aware, obviously, of the financial implications of the virus, which are dire. If that's then followed in December by over the cliff edge with Brexit, how on earth is that going to allow Scotland to prepare for independence and starting up a new currency and bank?
Well, it's an absolute insistent reason for doing exactly that, is to take to the lifeboat, escape before the whole ship sinks.
Will we have time to do that, though?
Yes, I think so.
Good.
You can, if necessary, you can accelerate the process. Slovakia had to launch its own currency in 2 months when the planned currency union with the Czech Republic collapsed after a few weeks. Estonia suddenly became independent in August 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. They didn't have much warning of that. They had their currency and central bank up and running within 9 months.
So do you think that this economic chaos that we're in the middle of could actually help us get independence quicker?
I think it'll persuade people that they need to find a lifeboat. You know, if the ocean liner is visibly, you know, the water's creeping up the portholes, you don't stay on board.
Okay, thank you.
There was a thing with the Titanic, you know, it was a very cold night at 0 degrees centigrade, and the passengers didn't want to leave until they realized the water was more or less up at the same level as them on the decks.
That would focus the mind wonderfully.
Okay, well, thanks, Tim, for that. That was very informative. Yes, everybody applaud.